For today, we are lucky to have Catharine Melin-Moser with us. So she's a writer and independent historian, and her Western history articles have appeared in various journals and magazines. She writes from her home in the Judith Mountains of central Montana, and today she's here to share with us about her very new book, When Montana Outraced the East, The Reign of Western Thoroughbreds, from 1886 to 1900. So welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. Well, good evening, and thank you for attending my presentation of When Montana Outraced the East. It will examine late 19th century thoroughbred breeding and horse racing in Montana and its contribution to American horse racing. This is my first book, but I've been freelance writing for magazines and journals since 2000. And one highlight of my freelance work was to pet a grandson of Secretariat. I grew up riding quarter horses, but I've always loved the thoroughbreds. When researching material for my freelance articles, this included combing through 19th century newspapers, where I found snippets of information that told of thoroughbred horses from Montana winning big eastern races. And one day in 2011, it struck me that I had found a fascinating piece of Montana sports history. And it so happened that I was peer reviewing a jerkline article for the Montana Historical Society. And one day when I finished up a phone conversation with the editor there, Molly Holtz, I screwed up my courage and I said, you know, I think I found this amazing story about these Montana horses. And she was intrigued and she wanted me to write about them. That article was called In the Winter Circle, and it was published in Montana, the magazine of Western history, in winter of 2014. And that became the foundation for this book. And Molly was the one who encouraged me to pursue it and turn it into a book. The book's cover depicts a painting of Montana's only winner of the Kentucky Derby, Spokane, and possibly the jockey is Thomas Kiley, who rode him in the Kentucky Derby. And artist Henry Stoll painted the portrait, as well as many more portraits of America's most famous thoroughbreds in the late 19th century. Montana's grass, generally known as bunch grass, is a foundation of which the story about thoroughbred horses and early frontiersmen is built. The frontiersmen reacted to the grass growing on every hill and foothill, valley, and bench. It's fair to say that thoroughbred breeding in 19th century Montana was owed to the grass. According to legend, Papoose, a thoroughbred horse from Kentucky, was stolen as a colt from Mullen Road travelers by an unspecified native tribe in 1859. Frontiersman Malcolm Clark likely acquired ownership of Billy Bay through his pagan Indian in-laws. Clark sold Billy Bay to Mrs. Virginia Slade of Virginia City, and it was on the back of Billy Bay that she made her desperate but futile ride to save the life of her husband, Jack Slade, a murderer and gunslinger, hanged by vigilantes in Virginia City in 1864. Caribou was the Kentucky bred. He was an old veteran of the race course, having fought many hard battles, and he was imported to Montana in 1876 by frontiersman Charles Williams. The Helena Daily Herald reported that Peekaboo had been named by a little girl. The filly's color was chestnut. She had a star and a crooked stripe down her nose. In the 1880s, Montana's frontiersmen turned millionaires. Noah Armstrong, Samuel Larrabee, and Marcus Daly. They turned from speculation in valuable minerals to speculation in valuable horses. They hypothesized that Montana's high altitude, grass, mountain air would produce thoroughbred dynamos. Traditional horse racing circles in the East and South laughed at the very idea, and they called it the various madness. They were certain that thoroughbred horses from out of Montana wilderness would be slow-footed, stumpy, and undersized, and some even predicted dwarfs as the outcome. And it's no wonder the East and South snickered. Let's put into perspective what the Montanans planned to do in an 1870s and 1880s context. Communications between frontier Montana and the East were spotty and slow. More than 1,000 miles separated Montana from eastern racetracks. A Chicago newspaper noted that between the months of October 1892 and March of 1893, Marcus Daly's racehorses had traveled 4,000 miles. Railroad terminuses were likely hundreds of miles away. The thoroughbred horses were trailed to Montana ranches, and along the way, there were horse thieves and native tribes posing threats. And the train travel risked injuries to the animals and was stressful. Blizzards halted trains in their tracks for hours, even days. Samuel Larrabee and Marcus Daly purchased Palace horse cars manufactured by the Arms Palace Horse Car Company, and it advertised substantially built stables on wheels for convenient, safe, humane, and economical transportation. So the prized horses would travel safely and comfortably. Our first frontiersman is Noah Armstrong. He was born in Ontario, Canada, arriving in the Idaho Territory in 1863. By 1874, he was working several silver lodes in the Pioneer Mountains. He constructed a racetrack in his company town of Hamilton. In 1875, he founded the Helka Consolidated Mining Company and amassed his fortune in silver mining. In 1882, Noah purchased a ranch in the Jefferson Valley near Twin Bridges. He named the outfit Doncaster Ranch for his standard-bred stallion, described as a splendid black. Noah himself designed the barn. The ground floor housed a 20-foot wide circular track for exercising and training the horses. And he spent thousands of dollars stocking the grand barn with well-bred and expensive thoroughbred and standard-bred horses. The barn still stands today and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and is honored in the Montana Cowboy Hall of Fame. Spokane is Montana's most famous thoroughbred. He was Illinois bred, and from the language of the Spokane Indian tribe, Spokane means children of the sun. In the spring of 1887, Cowboy Edwin Edgehill walked Spokane 28 miles from Doncaster Ranch to the depot at Dillon, Montana. At Memphis, Tennessee, Spokane received his formal training as a racehorse. In May of 1889, Spokane and Noah arrived at Churchill Downs to make a running at the 14th Kentucky Derby. Spokane and Noah were from the land of the teepee and tomahawk, and they garnered a lot of press for this, but sports writers swooned over Proctor Knott, the Derby favorite. As a 2-year-old in 1888, Proctor Knott won the Futurity Stakes, the richest race of the time. That purse was valued at $41,000, more than $1 million in today's dollars. The colt's owner was a Kentuckian, Sam Bryant, who touted Proctor Knott as the greatest horse to ever look through a bridle. Spokane joined Proctor Knott and 5 other fiery 3-year-olds at Churchill Downs. Early in the race, it wasn't even close. At the half-mile pole, Proctor Knott led Spokane by 5 lengths, and Spokane's jockey urged him faster, and Spokane mounted an explosion of speed. Stride for stride and head for head, Spokane and Proctor Knott pounded over the home stretch, and 25,000 people screamed themselves hoarse. At the finish, Spokane had outbobbed Proctor Knott by a flaming nostril. That was how one sports writer described the margin by which Spokane had defeated Proctor Knott. Even more painful to the Proctor Knott faithful, Spokane won the Derby in world record time. In the words of a San Francisco correspondent, the result was almost sickening to the vast throng of spectators. Most of them would have rather seen Spokane break his neck than break the record, and least of all, win the Derby from Proctor Knott. Noah retired Spokane at the end of 1890. He sold Doncaster Ranch in 1900 and moved to Seattle, where he died on April 21st, 1907. After victory in the Kentucky Derby and 2 more important races in the East, heavy weight handicaps, injuries, and a grueling race schedule depleted Spokane mentally and physically. He lost his remaining races in 1889, and he lost all of them in 1890. So what happened to Spokane? One account claimed he was returned to Doncaster Ranch and died there, but advertisement for his stud services in Lexington go into 1897 and debunk that account. Another claimed that he was injured and destroyed outside of Miles City, Montana. And on a happier note, that he lived on a ranch in Ennis, Montana, till the age of 30. Like the horse racing historians who came before me, I made repeated searches to find out Spokane's fate. In 1898, Spokane hobbled into a Kentucky sales ring, and amid laughs, he sold for $170. 1899, he was sold to J. Hume Carter, a New Jersey veterinarian, for $100. In 1900 and 1901, they entered the National Horse Show at Madison Square Garden, and they won prize money both years. Spokane's extraordinary life ended in 1904. He was then 15 years old, and one night in November of 2019, I found out what happened to Spokane. Tucked inside the pages of a New Jersey newspaper, I read, "After a long and useful career, The stallion Spokane, owned by Dr. Carter, passed in his checks. Folklore and pride for Montana's only winner of the Kentucky Derby landed him a berth in the Montana Cowboy Hall of Fame. Our second frontiersman turned thoroughbred breeder is Samuel E. Larrabee. He arrived in Virginia City in July of 1864, dabbled in mining, and became a banker in Deer Lodge. And Samuel is my favorite turfman of the three that I profile in my book. He was wise, a real gentleman, and he was empathetic to all people and animals. Samuel was one founder of the Larrabee Brothers Bank in Deer Lodge, and customers praised the institution as as sound and secure as the Rock of Gibraltar. The Larrabee Brothers Bank building still stands in Deer Lodge on Main Street, where it now serves as a quilting shop. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. Samuel purchased his first thoroughbreds horses in 1875 and imported them from Kentucky. He established 800-acre Willow Run stock farm outside of Deer Lodge. He ventured into Eastern horse racing with a partner, a Kentuckian, Augustine Easton. The racing stable was situated in Lexington, but Samuel directed the operation from Willow Run, and he also bred some of the stable's racehorses there. That unconventional arrangement also raised eyebrows among Eastern and Southern traditionalists, but Easton and Larrabee horses performed brilliantly on Eastern racetracks. Montana Regent is Montana's first turf star. He was bred at Willow Run, foaled in Lexington in 1894, and he won such big stakes races as the Hindu, Falsetto, Springbok, and Louisville Cup. He was sold in 1887 to Colorado mining millionaire John D. Morrissey for $10,000. So what is a Montana racehorse? In truth, most of Montana's acclaimed thoroughbreds were bred and foaled on eastern thoroughbred farms or southern plantations. While birthplace mattered to the breeders and owners, the detail was of slight interest to the public. When the Butte Daily Post of 1886 relayed the news of a Montana Regent victory on an eastern racetrack, it was no matter that he was foaled and trained in Kentucky. He was the Montana Thoroughbred and the Deer Lodge horse, and he illustrated a sense of regional ownership. When Samuel raced the winning filly Julia L., the Helena Independent headline read, "A Montana winner," and the Bozeman Weekly Chronicle used Montana flyers to inform its readers about the Montana mare. Julia L. was bred and foaled in Kentucky, but under Samuel's ownership, she was a Montana horse. Or as the New Northwest explained the misnomer, she is a true daughter of the bluegrass state, but we feel a real interest in the mare and her success, since she is the property of one of Montana's most thorough and successful breeders. This pretense of ownership would extend to future Montana runners who, like Julia L. and Montana Regent, were reared on bluegrass rather than on bunchgrass. But Poet Scout was a true native son, bred and foaled in Willow Run. At one point during his career, Easton and Larrabee refused $20,000 for him. Poet Scout had a half-brother named High Tariff, and from the time that they were weaned, they were never separated, and they were stabled in adjoining stalls. Both brothers competed in 1891 in the American Derby, a very prestigious Eastern race. High Tariff was challenging for the lead when he suddenly stalled and staggered 20 yards and dropped to the ground. The race continued, and Poet Scout nearly won it, finishing second. Then everyone's focus shifted back to High Tariff, where he lay crumpled on the ground, and he was dead on the racetrack. That evening, Poet Scout waited for his brother, and he refused to eat. And he whinnied all night, and he whinnied all the next day, and for the next several days and nights. And according to his grooms, Poet Scout grieved the death of High Tariff as much as any human being ever grieved at the death of a brother. Ben Holiday was Kentucky bred and foaled, and named for the flamboyant stagecoach king Ben Holiday. The horse exemplified the iron horse era. He shouldered monstrous weight over long distances. 2 miles wasn't uncommon. And he did it over and over, not only winning, but setting track records. In 1898, Ben Holiday won the municipal handicap an unprecedented 3rd time. And the New York Times asserted, there were many who, while they believed him to be the best horse, could not see how he could win the same stakes race in 3 years' succession. His feat is unequaled in the history of the turf. In 5 seasons of racing, he finished 3rd or better in 49 of 60 starts. And then early in the 20th century, American horse racing adopted a new perspective. Race horses would rarely run more than 30 starts in a year or in an entire career. Distances became shorter and weight became less. At 16.2 hands, Kinley Mack was tall and rangy and covered a lot of ground. He was foaled in California, but raised at Willow Run, where he found some trouble. One day he entangled his legs in a fence, and the harder he tried to free himself, the more damage he did to his legs. And being a sweet-tempered horse, Kinley Mack permitted his caregiver to spend weeks, maybe months, treating his legs. In retrospective of the accident, a 19th century horse racing historian wrote, "The wonder was he ever accomplished what he did." The partnership ended, and the New York Sun opined, "No one begrudges the victory of a horse owned by Easton and Larrabee, a firm of true sportsmen who spared neither ponies nor money in their efforts to breed stakes winners for the racing establishment, and who have bred more high-class horses than any racing firm in America within the past dozen years, when it is taken into consideration that they own and breed not more than 15 mares." Augustine Easton died of pneumonia on February 20th, 1914. Samuel foaled 2 months later at age 68, possibly of a heart attack while at work at the Larrabee Brothers Bank. He was eulogized as the backbone of Deer Lodge. Our third frontiersman turned horse racing tycoon is Marcus Daly. He arrived in New York from Ireland in 1856. After working at the New York City shipyards, he headed to California, where he dug potatoes for a grub stake that got him to the Northern California gold fields. He made his fortune in copper mining in Butte and Anaconda, constructed a racetrack in Hamilton, his company town, and became president of the Montana Jockey Club. The timing of Marcus's discovery of a large copper vein in the Anaconda mine was perfect. Demand for copper was on the threshold of skyrocketing as electric power infrastructure advanced across the world. By the 1890s, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company dominated the Montana economy as well as the North American copper industry. Marcus built a summer retreat called Riverside and a horse nursery called Bitterroot Stock Farm near Hamilton in the Bitterroot Valley. The farm featured multiple stables, a horse hospital, horse bath, resident veterinarian, multiple exercise tracks and housing for trainers, exercise riders, and stable hands. Montana was the first thoroughbred to bring fame to Marcus Daly and the Bitterroot Stock Farm. He was an ugly horse and he was mean. At 2 years old in 1890, he made 3 starts and lost all 3. At age 3, he made 9 starts and he lost all 9. Montana, however, embodies the Cinderella story we all love. In 1892, at the Suburban Handicap, the 11-horse field featured America's fastest thoroughbreds. Montana managed to keep pace with them into the home stretch, but trailed the leader by 3 lengths. Jockey Snapper Garrison gave Montana a shove with his spurs, and Montana stormed down the track to win the race by a head. Marcus had bet $1,000 on Montana at 40-to-1 odds. On the day of the race, his winning ticket burned in a fire, and his bad luck only grew worse. The bookmaker with whom he'd placed the bet had died, and Marcus was out $40,000. A friend said, "Mr. Daly didn't care about the money. What mattered to him was that Montana won the race." Tammany was as much as a pet as he was a great racehorse. He played with puppies in his stall and he loved children. And he also thundered down the Eastern racing establishment in 1891 and 1892. Winning multiple stakes races. In 1893, Tammany and Tennessee-bred Lamplighter were the darlings of American horse racing. And Lamplighter from New York and Tammany from Montana sparked an East versus West rivalry. A match race to decide who was greater was set for September 28th at the Gutenberg Racetrack in New Jersey. And Tammany went to the post slightly favored over Lamplighter. Yet it was Lamplighter springing into the lead and setting the blistering pace. And through the final quarter mile, Tammany trailed Lamplighter by a length. And jockey Snapper Garrison urged Tammany faster, and his swooping strides gobbled up Lamplighter's marginal lead. At the finish, Tammany defeated Lamplighter by more than 3 lengths and set a new track record for the distance. On October 5th of 1893, Tammany journeyed from New York back home to the Bitterroot Stock Farm. And no sooner was he home than he became very sick. The 2 veterinarians treating him were perplexed. Their medicine wasn't working. The Bitterroot boys resorted to unconventional methods of their own, and as one of them told it, After 9 days of nursing, during which he was fed porter, ale, and champagne, he was on the road to recovery. Eastern turf riders covering the 1896 futurity grumbled loudly when Ogden dropped into their laps virtually overnight with some kid jockey, Frank Doc Tuberville. On Futurity Day at Sheepshead Bay Racetrack in New York, Ogden and 8 more high-voltage 2-year-olds stood ready at the post. The starter's flag twirled, and Ogden and the favorite Ornament sprang ahead of the field with Ornament leading. The crowd jumped and screamed for Ornament before shrieking and wailing when Ogden pulled slightly ahead of their favorite. Doc Tuberville, not wanting to risk anything to chance, touched Ogden once with whip and spur, and Ogden wheeled past the finish more than a length ahead of Ornament. And the next morning, the New York Journal headline exclaimed, "Ogden the Westerner first. Futurity's great prize taken by a horse of mystery, ridden by a boy of mystery." Scottish Chieftain is my favorite of the race horses. After researching each horse extensively, I came to know them all so well. And Scottish Chieftain, he was a good racehorse, but he wasn't a great one. But he was, in my opinion, underappreciated for what he did accomplish. I never found a photograph or illustration of him, but this was his sire, Inverness, and his dam, Miss Darebin. And he must have been a good-sized horse because Marcus Daly called him the big horse. And Marcus figured on winning the 1897 Belmont Stakes with Ogden, but in the final furlongs of that race, Ogden was nowhere in sight. But Scottish Chieftain was running right alongside the leaders, and he thundered toward the finish line, and he won that race by a length. And Ogden straggled in last. The next year, Scottish Chieftain raced on the Montana circuit at Butte, Anaconda, and Great Falls. And then in 1899, he was sold during a Bitterroot stock farm sale. Marcus Daly died November 12, 1900 in New York City. In 1901, his 369 of his thoroughbreds were sold at a series of auctions at Madison Square Garden, grossing more than $700,000, the richest dispersal sale of a racing stable in America at that time. James Ben-Ali Hagan was Marcus's longtime business associate and probably his closest friend. Hagan is credited with introducing Marcus to thoroughbred breeding and racing. The men had an extraordinary run. The nation's eminent turfmen, turf riders, and sporting publications repeated the names of their famed flyers from out of that nowhere in the West. The swift horses won the biggest prizes, shaped historical events, were sources of regional pride and fodder for local lore. In Montana, on both coasts and in between, they outraced the East. Are there any questions? I could talk about this all night.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll come over with the mic.
No?
Kathy, you had a slide of Tammany, and in the lower right corner was a picture of Tammany's castle.
Yes.
And you said, I guess the caption was Tammany was rewarded.
Yes.
Was that for the race against Lamplighter?
The legend goes that before the match race, Marcus Daly went into the judges' stand where the judges were, and then the owner of Lamplighter, he was there. And Marcus Daly made a promise to himself that if Tammany wins, I'll build him a castle. And then Tammany won, and Marcus built him a castle. And he loved that horse. And there's I can't remember the name of the bar. I can't remember if it was an Anaconda or a Butte. But he had a Tiffany's craftsman come in and inlay little tiny pieces of wood and did a portrait of Tammany's head on the barroom floor of this big hotel. And Marcus would never step on the portrait. And he told all his workers, nobody steps on that horse's head. And they tore that hotel down in the Marcus Daly Mansion in Hamilton. They cut that out. And so they have that inlay in the mansion where you can see it. And he had several portraits painted of Tammany, and Tammany was his favorite thoroughbred. Any other questions? Yes?
What is the status of horse racing? What is the status of horse racing in Montana now?
That's, I'm 19th century, 18th century. What I do know is that over the last few years, there have been efforts to bring it back to Billings and Great Falls. And honestly, how successful that's been, I don't know. Yes?
Thank you. I don't know if I remember correctly, but I thought there was a statue of Tammany made, or...
No, that I don't know of.
I don't know why I think that, but okay, thanks.
There was a statue of Marcus Daly viewed, and the story goes with that. They unveiled a statue of Marcus, and he's just standing on this pedestal. And apparently this old miner said, in his Irish brogue, they screwed up. They should have had him on a big horse. Yes?
How many horses did the owners' palace cars accommodate?
I think they had 16. They would have 8 on one side and then 8 on the other.
Did the caretakers travel in those cars?
Yeah, they had a special compartment where they had a handler and then the hay and the tack.
Do you know if the Northern Pacific ever purchased those cars from Arms Palace? Or Montana?
You're asking what happened to the cars after Daly died? Or?
Did the Northern Pacific Railway purchase those cars for use on their railway?
No. These cars were custom built for Samuel Larrabee. Well, I don't think Larrabee had his custom built, but Daly did. And he ended up buying 4 of them. And 3 of them were for his horses. And then he had a 4th car for his family. And it was, of course, very luxurious. But the story goes that when Marcus traveled without his family, he just got in a regular passenger car and traveled. And the other story goes that whenever he did travel, he always traveled with a rocking chair and a dog.
How did the handicapping work? Did they carry lead around, and how did that work with the...
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, that...
Yes.
Horses have to carry what they call an impost or weight. So if they're really good horses like Ben Holiday, they carried real heavy weight, 130 pounds, 125 pounds. And the other horses that weren't as good, they carried maybe 110, 120 pounds to try and even out the field. And so if the jockey and the tack did not make weight of, say, 120 pounds, then they would insert lead slabs into the saddle pads of the horses, saddle pads, so the horse would be carrying 120 pounds. So the jockeys, yeah, they were always, boy, they really calculated, their weight. And there's a section in this book just about the jockeys and what they had to do to make weight and the things that they did to make weight. And I mean, those days, there was no regulation. As I was telling Sandy, Snapper Garrison, he would never eat, and they'd take all kinds of horrible stuff to flush themselves out. And at one big race, he literally fainted before getting on his horse, and they, slapped him, pushed him around and threw him up on the horse, and he won. And then he fainted a second time, and they put him up on that horse. But I don't think he won that race, but he was like second or third. And then, they had, the other thing with the jockeys that was amazing was that, usually they were illiterate, and, they just pick them up off the street, and they'd start working in the stables. And, long story short, they started earning thousands and thousands of dollars if they were really good. And of course, they had no idea how to manage their money. And every single one of the jockeys that I profile in that book had a, terrible ending, and they all died broke. And that's just it's really a sad story. And the other side of that too was in the 1890s, up into about the mid-1890s, from pre-Civil War, it was black slaves in the South and, young black men in the North that were the jockeys. And then when horse racing became more and more popular, and the men who were racing them were wealthy, of course they started paying the black jockeys really good salaries. And and eventually the white guys started figuring out, this is a good way to make a lot of money. So then literally in like 5 years they were pushing the black jockeys out. And so that's a whole, when I started this research of this book, I thought I was going to write about, 3 horsemen and horses. And it just went off in all these different directions, especially, the jockeys and the trainers. They're really eccentric, and they're just like tapping me on the shoulder saying, we have stories to tell. So I ended up, bringing all that into the book because it was integral to the story. So it's much more than just about, these 3 men and those horses and the, 1890s horse racing history and the big tracks that they built in the East. They were very lavish. And then the whole thing with, what was proper for a woman at a racetrack and the men, and, the women weren't allowed to go to certain places and their men would go bet for them. And so, yeah, it's...
When I think about, taking a horse on a train from here all the way back east, it probably wasn't, they just stayed in the car and they went all the way there. There must have been facilities or special concerns to take care of the horses as they traveled, much like we would have hotels. They must have had facilities to take care of them, and it'd probably take a long time to get them over there because I imagine they weren't constantly traveling.
Yeah, I have no idea, 1,000 miles from Montana to the eastern racetracks. And they just would stop and take them out. Chicago was the big, or St. Louis or Chicago, that was the big stopping point where they would unload them and maybe leave them overnight for a day before then sending them to New York or Kentucky or wherever they were going. And and that whole, that was another element of the story is, you've got practically a frontier. And like I was saying earlier, getting these horses and, bringing them to Montana in the first place and then sending them back to do this racing. And there's stories, horror stories about horses dying on the way. And but I mean, that was such a huge part of it, but just totally blew me away. It's like, how did they do this? And they did it, and then, they were so successful, and it just, nobody back east thought, this would ever work. And so we proved them right. Wrong. And there were no dwarfs. So.
Did they ever get into quarter horse racing?
No, they just, these men were pretty much thoroughbreds and standardbreds. Marcus Daly got into like Irish hunters, and he liked raising draft horses as well. But I don't even know if they had quarter horses that earlier. I think that's a fairly new breed. Or that late, or that early.
Did you find much detail about the disposal of the horses after his death?
Yeah, it's pretty brutal. I found this, a beautiful quote, and it's in the book. And I don't remember the full quote, but what this turf rider was saying, you have these beautiful horses, and there they go, up to the post, and they're parading, and, sometimes they did die on the track, like High Tariff did. And then basically what he said, they're nothing more than a truck horse, because they just came out with, big wagon and, roped them up and hauled them off the track.
In modern day racing right now, there's a big concern about drugging horses. And I imagine when you're talking big money back then, was there a drugging issue, or was it just kind of not mentioned?
There's a whole section in the book about that, what they did to them. They'd stuff sponges up their nostrils. They'd give them cocaine. They, put stuff up their rear ends. It was, there was a lot of, deliberate abuse of the horses, unfortunately. Not so much with the wealthy people that were racing them. It was the lower ranks. And that, it became pretty corrupt. And then the original jockey club was called the Board of Regulation, or the Board of Racing. And it was like 8 really wealthy thoroughbred owners back east, and they formed the original jockey club, trying to put an end to the abuse of horses and fixed racing and cheating and all that. And eventually they were successful. It evolved into the jockey club, and regulations were passed. A lot of that was in the east for a long time. It took a long time to come west. And they called, like Western tracks, they called them the bush tracks. And it was just crazy. These jockeys, they just got on their horses and they fought, and there was no rules. It was just whoever won. And there were, people shooting each other in the stands. And one of my jockeys, Fred Terrell, that was how he got his start. He was riding the bush tracks in Oklahoma. That was just crazy. And then he eventually went to Chicago, and he became a very famous jockey. And he rode for Larrabee, and he rode for Daly. And that was another interesting thing. The real famous jockeys, there was this little pool of very famous, wealthy turf men, and these jockeys, they all rode for these men's horses, so there was a lot of overlap. And Snapper Garrison, he rode for both Armstrong, Daly, and Larrabee. So there's, yeah, you'll see that through the chapters where I bring the jockeys in and out.
Today, where would you recommend any landmarks that are left? You mentioned that stable is still down near, is it Twin Bridges? Anyway, where should we go if we want a taste of this?
Marcus Daly Mansion, that's Bitterroot Stock Farm. Not, it's like, I think it's only 60 acres now, but the mansion is wonderful. And you can't, well, Tammany Castle is now a private home. And Larrabee Brothers Bank, that's in Deer Lodge. And what's the other one? Let's see, what else? Oh, the barn at Twin Bridges is still standing down there. There's really not, Larrabee's farm is gone. Oh, I don't know if you're familiar with the Grant Coors National Historic Site out at Deer Lodge. Well, Samuel Larrabee and Conrad Coors, they were neighbors. And Larrabee's farm was right across the road from Grant Coors Ranch. And of course now that's an industrial area. But Conrad Coors, he's in the book too. And he is credited with encouraging Larrabee to start raising thoroughbreds. And Conrad Coors and his brother John Bielenberg, they were actually probably the first men who imported thoroughbred horses to Montana and bred them. But they never raced them they raced them in the East, but they never, pursued the really big races. But he is definitely mentioned in the book.
Me again. At the Kentucky Derby, they mentioned all the horses running were descendants of Secretariat. Has there been descendants of these horses that have been impressive or have gotten some fame?
Ogden, he's really the only one of all these horses that went and became really famous. He was actually more famous as a sire than he was a racehorse. And I think that slide talked about Colin. And Colin is considered one of the greatest horses that raced in the 20th century. And there's a story about Colin's jockey. And so Colin raced like early 1900s, and then Man o' War came along in 1915. And so, everybody went crazy about Man o' War, but Man o' War lost a race. And so, I can't remember his name, but Colin's jockey, when they were going on and on about Man o' War, he said, yeah, but Colin never lost a race. But I thought that was pretty amazing. There were, 18 horses in the Derby, I think, that ran, and I saw that. They were all had Secretariat blood. The others, the one horse I didn't talk a lot about was Hamburg. He was one of Marcus Daly's really famous stallions. And he just wasn't in the picture. He's in the book, but he just really wasn't in a big enough picture to include him in my slideshow. But he was another one. He went on to be a really famous sire too. And a lot of, even I think let's see, that was, Whirl Away was a Triple Crown winner, I think 1940. And he was descended from Hamburg. And Hamburg's daughter, it wasn't so much Hamburg's sons, they weren't, that great. It was really his daughters. They became really great brood mares.
Where's the picture of the horse on the floor?
It's now at the Marcus Daly Mansion.
And can you go through there?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it's open to the public. It's a wonderful place.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're ever in Hamilton, make time to stop in there and get a tour.
Thank you.
They've done a beautiful job restoring that mansion.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.